Thank you very much, Mary. Yes, it's wonderful your mother's here tonight, Gay. She was one of the first people I met in 1991 in Mogadishu when the war was in absolutely full swing, and we had a few very scary days together that time. Now, I'm going to ask comments on what Mary has written and open up the whole topic for debate.
Congratulations to Mary, really, because I think she's written one of the most terrific books that has been written about Somalia of lately. A lot of people have written books, but have not had the kind of experience, and especially the journalistic experience. As a journalist myself, I do understand that academics sometimes don't like us, and that's a mutual feeling. We don't like them too. But I gotta say, it was a pretty impressive book. I did write a little bit of a review for the Royal African Institute, and I pointed out a few things, so I'll just go through them fairly quickly. First of all, again, the book is very comprehensive. If you know nothing about Somalia and you are going to start to read this book, a fairly small book, you are going to get a very good understanding of the most pressing issues that are facing Somalia today without being bored into the nitty-gritty details of Somalia, especially the historical part of it. So Mary has done a pretty good job of keeping this book as recent as possible. She talks about issues of piracy, terrorism, humanitarian, political Islam, and one of the most fascinating parts is clanism. It's very accessible book. In other words, again, here is the problem we have with academics. They tend to write in a very convoluted sentences, very complicated concepts. You have a journalist here who has written very small, very short, and very concise writing, and that's one of the things I really appreciated about the book. The issues that Mary has written about, I'll pick on a few things. Number one, let me start with the title of the book, which is Getting Somalia Wrong. I think Mary has done a very good job in explaining why and how the international community has gotten Somalia wrong over the past 20 years, starting with the Black Hawk Down episode that Mary has just talked about, in which 18 American servicemen and some unknown countless Somalis probably were killed in October of 1993 and following. And she documents that operation, which really started as an Operation Restore Hope, and did some pretty good job in terms of saving thousands of Somalis who were starving to death, but really went out of its way and tried to essentially take sides on what was at the time a perpetual civil war in Mogadishu. So Mary in the book does a good documentation, and she says that may have been the most dramatic experience of getting Somalia wrong. And I said in my review that may have been the beginning, actually, of getting Somalia wrong, because I thought that the most dramatic experience of getting Somalia wrong by the international community was the 2006-2007 intervention of Ethiopia into Somalia, sanctioned and approved and actually assisted by the United States. So that was probably the most dramatic, probably the worst example of how the international community thought the Union of Islamic Courts, a group of loosely connected Islamic courts, clan-based Islamic courts, essentially neighborhood watchmen in Mogadishu, getting together and pacifying the city, and then being viewed by the international community, principally the United States, as some kind of an al-Qaeda outfit. Of course, al-Shabaab at the time was part of the Union of Islamic Courts, but by no means were they an al-Qaeda outfit. And Mary does report how that misreading of the Union of Islamic Courts led to the exact opposite of what the U.S. was hoping when the U.S. encouraged Ethiopia to invade Somalia in the early days of 2007. The idea was to crush an Islamist movement in Somalia, but what we've actually ended up with is a more lethal, more extremist, and more jihadist faction of that Islamist group, which is al-Shabaab today. Al-Shabaab essentially was born out of this opportunity of having, for them it was an opportunity of having, a Christian powerful nation invading Somalia. And it's not every Christian nation. Ethiopia, if you know anything about the history of the Horn of Africa, is widely disliked in Somalia, not the people, but the enmity between the two countries. So that is, I think, the gist of the book. The other thing that the book spends quite a bit of time is the issue of clanism, which is, I was quite impressed with how Mary was able to really demystify one of the most complex issues that I, even as Somali, someone who was born in Somalia, still have a hard time understanding, the mechanics of it. Mary kind of tells you that the Somali, that clan is a part of our innate, inherent identity, whether Somalis in the diaspora tend to shove away and like to deny that we're not clanists and so on. But the fact of the matter is that, clan forms a part of the principal identity of the Somali person. That does not necessarily mean, obviously, that, the person hates other clans or loves other clans and so on. But it does play a central role in the shaping of the view of the average Somali. And the conflicts that we see in Somalia today, even if they take other shapes, say, if al-Shabaab is fighting the Somali government, anyone who knows anything about Somalia could go and identify a clan dimension to it. So, the idea, the notion of clan goes across Somalia anywhere. The third point I picked on the book was how Mary was able to point out something that has been ignored by people who have written books about Somalia, which is to decouple the capital city, Mogadishu, from the rest of Somalia. Everyone talks about Somalia as this violent, perpetually chaotic place, but it really, that's mostly a description that is very much isolated to Mogadishu more than anywhere else. For example, in central Somalia, where there may not be a central authority today, but it has been relatively peaceful for the past 20 years. And if you go to northern Somalia, whether it's northeast and now called Puntland, or northwest Somaliland, you would even see, as Mary documents so well, governments really running much better than most African countries. I mean, Somaliland, as Mary writes, is now run significantly better than a lot of African countries. They have a fairly functioning democratic system. Now, of course, people have, in Somalia, emotions fly when you talk about the issue of Somaliland. Speaking of that, reading the book, one gets the sense that Mary does appreciate the peace and stability in Somaliland, the fact that Somaliland have been self-governing itself for the past 20 years. And then points out, as she just said, that Somaliland could offer a model of stability for the rest of Somalia. Now, of course, a lot of Somalis are still unhappy to see part of Somalia, ceding from the rest of the country unilaterally, that's a political point to be argued on. But no one can argue that Somaliland has really done a fairly admirable job in terms of stabilizing itself, running its operation, its affairs fairly well. Briefly, Mary in the book talks about again how, and it's in the title of the book, that there is actually hope in Somalia, and I think that hope is centered around the idea of having vibrant business community and a vibrant civil society across the country. It's not specific to a region. Even in Mogadishu, there are, 9 universities in Mogadishu today. Some of them are graduating thousands of students every year. These are things that are not talked about. I mean, I've been to Mogadishu last year some 5 times or so, and I was so impressed to see that the vibrance of civil society, whether it is educational institutions or other think tanks and business communities and so on. So that's part that we as media are guilty of, focusing on the gloom and doom and not really looking into the bright sides. I'll conclude with few points that I found to be that I think may raise some concerns in the book for the Somali reader and maybe for people who follow Somalia. Number one is, when Mary talked about the issue of violent Islamic extremism in Somalia, or violent Islamism in general, she said that it traces back to Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, a person who in the Somali psyche is held as the foremost hero in Somalia, and to be described as a violent Islamist, I think many Somalis would find that quite hard to swallow. of course, again, there is a controversy surrounding Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan. Even within the Somali society, a lot of people viewed him as a murderer because he, in fact, ended up killing a lot of Somalis while he was fighting the British colonialists. But I think it's fair to say that, broadly speaking, he is now held as the foremost hero, the most respected person in terms of fighting for the freedom of Somalia. The other point that I found to have needed some more explanation in the book was the issue of federalism, which Mary points out as a model, as a possible model for solution to people and groups and clans and regions that have some grievances in Somalia, primarily Somaliland, for example. That federalism could offer something of a local control in a system of governance that does not allow the central government to control everything, as the case used to be in Somalia before the collapse of the central government in 1991. As you may know, the current charter, the law of the land, so to speak, says that Somalia should be a federal state, but no one has ever defined what federalism means in Somalia. And I found that it's so difficult to use these words without really defining. I mean, if you look at the 29 odd countries that are federals, that use the federal system around the world, they tend to be vast countries, extremely diverse countries, and countries with heterogeneous societies. Somalia is none of that. Very small country, fairly small people, number of people, 8 million or so, and exceptionally homogeneous group of people who are something like 99.9 Muslim and some 90% all ethnic Somalis, and so on and so forth, speaking the same language, coming from the same ethnicity. So the idea of making Somalia a federal state, while we have it in the law of the land, is simply odd. It just does not fit into Somalia. But I take the point that we need some kind of a decentralized system in Somalia where, you know, people who have grievances within with the central state can have, as you have here in the UK, a decentralized system where, you know, you can have a say or you can have a local control, but, you know, federalism does not simply cut with Somalia. And I thought that Mary needed to explain a bit more if she was going to use that. Finally, the final point is, you know, she does write that there has been some chatter within the Somali elite and others as well, who said that maybe this time around the solution of Somalia should be viewed through Somaliland. What does that mean? That means that you know, all these 14 attempts that has been made over the past 20 years to try to pacify Somalia have all been done in a neighboring country at what has been known as the Reconciliation Conference, and then a government is parachuted into Mogadishu, and it's generally dead on arrival. It has been the case for the past 20 years. It has not changed. So a lot of people have written about the idea of envisioning Somalia through Somaliland and giving Somaliland the ability to lead Somalia from Hargeisa and moving the capital from Mogadishu. It's a provocative idea. Even Somalilanders may not be open to it, but I thought it was an interesting point to be raised in the book, but one that needed a bit more discussion and probably some time to invest. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Abdi. And now Nuruddin Dura.
Diria.
Diria. Sorry, Diria.
Because Dira means completely different thing in Somali. Thank you very much. Ain't that looked like an academic review. I don't know why you don't like academic people. I'm not an academic, but I like both academics and
Politician.
What?
Well, you're a politician, which could
with
be
a small p. Yeah. Thank you very much, and I also congratulate Mary for writing an almost pleasant book about Somalia, which is quite unusual for a journalist, I think. And I enjoyed it. It's a fascinating book for someone who's new to Somalia, but someone who fairly knows quite a lot about Somalia as well. Maybe I would have started with early in our history, we made a huge contribution to humanity. According to the latest British scientific discovery, it was a small group of us in East Africa that crossed continents and populated the whole world later on.
You mean we're all Somalis?
Exactly. So it's not going to be an overstatement on my part when I talk about the great debt the world owes us for being quite active in that area. But also a little description of how a Somali person looks like. They're mostly tall and thin. No, with notable exceptions, of course.
People who are exiled, they change.
They range from red-brown to black in color, and to most women in this world, Somali men are very, very handsome indeed. But I immensely enjoyed the description that you've given to the Somali person in the book. The energetic Somali, the dynamic Somali, the innovative Somali. But I also felt uneasy about letting all our secrets out. The disparaging names we give to different communities. I'm not going to use that anymore. I'm not going to use Galo anymore. I'm not going to say Indayar anymore. And all that secrets are out. So watch out, Somalis. Don't call people names. But I think Mary is asking a very important question, saying that how do we know what we know about Somalia? To politicians, to media people, or even to aid communities. And what Somalia is described. And do we have the whole picture? And since a lot of international community partners are not inside the country, they should really look into the information they have about Somalia and how they know what they know about Somalia. Because what we have is not a full picture. To the aid community, for example, that do not have access to Somalia or can't access the people who need humanitarian assistance, how can they take an example of the Somali business community that in last month, in January, issued 2 million itemized invoices in Somalia, sending to their customers, and getting their money back from the customers while Somalia does not have a postal system. I have seen how this system works, and it's incredible how it's a Somali-style, organized chaos kind of a style that we are able to do our own work. Those are specific examples that people who are trying to help Somalia or work with Somalia can actually take an example from. Or to our CAT networks. I don't know anybody who knows CAT and how the CAT networks work. They do not stop for anything in Somalia, whether it's drought or flood or conflict epidemics, or even tsunami. I was present in one time in Somalia where the whole country was at standstill due to floods, and the only thing that was moving was CAT, going into every little village and every little town in Somalia exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning. And while working for UNICEF, I tried to persuade my bosses to say, why don't we use CAT networks to vaccinate children for us? Because they can reach everybody, and probably we'll have 100% vaccination coverage if we do that. Of course, I wasn't successful. But I think also to mention that everything about Somalia is not a failure. And there have been a lot of success in our recent past. It might be astonishing to a lot of people that do not follow Somalia, but back in the 60s, Somalia was exemplified as a model democracy. We could boast about freedom of expression, freedom of association, political parties, to the point of a chaos as well. Admittedly, that system of democracy and freedom was superseded by a military dictatorship. Such was the case at the time in Africa. But even then, during the military dictatorship, Somalia was very peaceful. I grew up in this era, and I do remember every morning being energized by the national Somali student song, Ardayban Ahayo, Ardayban Ahayo, Ubihi Wadankan Ahayo. I'm not going to explain it, but that's what it means. Or doctors and dentists coming to our schools to give us a regular health checkup. That is not mentioned anywhere when you read about Somalia. But also our successes were not consigned to the past. Even today, as Mary talks about a lot, we have very visible successes, where it's our business communities that are making the entire life tick in Somalia. So much so that the economy of Somalia is larger than many African countries, including Burundi, that's giving us, peacekeeping forces today. The per capita income of Somalia today is larger than many neighboring countries. But this is not an attempt, and I hope that people who are reading this will not see as a call for getting rid of government in Somalia, or there's no need for a state or even a strong state. I think we still do need a government, and we do need a very strong state in Somalia. For one, it's very crucially important for people like us politicians. What else we will do? It's our career, so don't starve us. But for another, it's very, very important for people who are very weak in Somalia and very vulnerable. All the successes and opportunities that we talk about is not accessible to the most vulnerable groups in our society. Those people do need a state that can stand for them, that can create opportunities for them, that can create safety nets for them. And I think that's why almost 2 million Somalis are now living as internally displaced people, essentially refugees in their own countries. That's the people that need the state most. But moving on to the expected upcoming conference here in London. First, I hope all those 40 countries and 40 heads of states and 40 governments that are coming will buy this book and read it before they come. Isn't that enough for you, Barry? And ponder about the full picture of Somalia before they come. Second, I hope this time we will learn lessons, the unlearned lessons of all the international involvement that the world talks about. First and foremost, I hope more international engagement or involvement is not a euphemism for bombing out more villages. That's one. Second, I hope that the Somali-led initiatives and the Somali-led successes will be appreciated enough, will be enforced enough, will be supported enough. The roadmap we talked about today, on the Ghetto principle we talk about today, that a lot of you who follow Somalia know, is perhaps the first political process that is talking about the next phase of Somali political dispensation, that's being led by Somali stakeholders and being convened inside Somalia for the first time. I think it's important the world to recognize that and to support that. It's not perfect. There are a lot of holes within that plan. There are a lot of systems that the current leaders put in place in order to come back. We need to work around that and try to make it as transparent as we can. But I think the same amount of patience and the same amount of support that's been given to the other internationally led processes need to be given this one. that kind of a chance and opportunity needs to be given. That kind of amount of hand-holding needs to be given. The latest one in Djibouti, 1 year the international community were giving that process a chance. The one before that in Nairobi, 2 years of discussions was given a space. Now, for the first time inside Somalia, I think the international community should commit to support that process, to help the Somali people, not to circumvent it, not to come up with another plan, because that will be seen by the Somali people that their own initiatives are not being appreciated. And for the last 20 years, on a political and governance level, the only thing that worked in Somalia are the local initiative and local successes, whether it's Somaliland, whether it's Puntland, Galmudug, and many other form in business or private sector or civil societies. I hope the world will learn that lesson. I hope there will be a genuine help this time, not an interest-veiled help. And I hope the Somalis will be supported to be first at peace with themselves, peace with their neighbors, and peace with the rest of the world. And it's a very nice book, and I recommend to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nuruddin. Now, I know many people are standing; they must be getting tired. So we'll try and do the question and answer fairly quickly. Who would like to ask the first question? Yep. Come on. Okay. Yes, the gentleman here. Yep.
Just ask, in the up-and-coming conference, how much is Somalia involved?
Yeah. Yeah. Very simple question. How much is Somalia involved in the upcoming conference? Yes.
Thank you very much. First, I want to congratulate Mary for this nice book, which yes, I would say first I want to congratulate Mary for coming up with this very comprehensive book, which shows the other part of Somalia, and also the book also recognizes as well that the issues with people talk about piracy, coming and everything is there. And as such, it is something which would be helpful in discussing the future of Somalia. Nevertheless, we have to be also be realistic. When I was in the early 90s, when Somalia first intervention came in this modern world, we were very astonished, opposing, because we saw it first as an opportunity which would have solved the problem, but it potentially also create a problem which might be addressed for any future interventions. And now 20 years after now, when Somalia have been repeated discussions and concerns, it seems that the problem and the issues now are no more a Somali issue. It has past neighbors, their mission, which trigger a huge interest from the neighboring countries. And as such, I would compliment how come we could say that this issue is a Somali only, when the issue we created has split between Djibouti and as well as Africa, with a lot of people. So how can we do that? Can we say we have the control?
Okay. All right. And I'll take one more question. We'll take them in threes. Yes, here in the front.
Thank you, Mary. Really, it's a very interesting book. But I disagree on one issue which I need to raise, similar to what my friend raised, the issue of intervention in Somalia today. And Mr. Diri also said it should be a Somaliland. What is in Somalia today is not a Somaliland. There is strong involvement of neighboring countries in Somalia, and they are very well versed in claiming the internal dynamics of the Somali people, because Somalis are currently very weak socially because of the 20 years of civil war. It's very easy for the neighboring countries to manipulate. And the only solution, in my opinion, today is coordinated international intervention in Somalia. If that does not happen, Somalia is going down. Because internally Somalis are divided, and the neighboring countries are very, very, very well versed in dividing further Somali people. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary, would you like to respond to those? If you bring the microphone down.
I think the question about how much Somalia is going to be involved in this conference, I might leave that one for Nuruddin. I think he might be more well versed in that. But maybe briefly, the issue of international interventions. I mean, you sort of seem to be calling on one side for a dramatic international intervention in Somalia, and that's the only thing that can save it. But if you look at what's gone on over the past 20 years, I think the record has been very poor. It's not to say that the world should turn its back on Somalia, because that's what happened after the Americans and the United States left, and the United Nations left in the early 1990s, and that also had its own set of problems. But I think, you know, asking for the outside world to come and rescue Somalia is absolutely the wrong approach, because unless the Somalis have proved in lots of places, like I talked about earlier, in business, women's groups, in many regions of that territory, they've proved that they can do it on their own. And in fact, I think the most successful example is Somaliland, where the outside world left Somaliland on its own. Somaliland was the most destroyed part of the Somali territories, and they got on with it on their own, and they proved that they could develop their own system of democracy, their own model that worked. So the argument, the request for more international intervention, I don't really see that as an answer.
How Somalis? I note colleagues from the Foreign Office are in the audience. Perhaps they can tell us more. But as far as I know, I think the British government, first and foremost, are engaging the international partners, because this is an international conference to coordinate the international effort. This is the stated objectives, to coordinate the international efforts and to catalyze a more innovative engagement with Somalia. And I'm also aware that the Somali stakeholders, the politicians, I mean, in central Somalia, in northern Somalia, are all involved. They have been invited and they've been discussed with. But I also know that the British government, particularly the Foreign Office, has been holding a series of consultation meetings with the Somali diaspora here, but also with international organizations that are working in Somalia. And how much of that conference how much of those consultations are going to have an impact on the conference remains to be seen. As we speak, I think the consultation is going on. But what we really need more is a wider engagement with the Somali people, and I think the British government tried their best to do so by having a blog about the conference on the British Embassy in Nairobi, And I think that blog is receiving a lot of debate. A lot of it is not relevant, but I mean the talking is going on. The talking is going on, and I've been receiving a lot of calls from inside Somalia, to my surprise, saying that we are debating over the British website about the conference, and they are writing about. So how much that is widespread, I don't know, but I know that as Mary also said in the book, the Somalis are very, wired into the global system. So consultation is going on. How much it will have an impact on the process, not only the conference but after that, is something to be seen in the future.
Yeah.
I think that was a very important question, how much of Somalia is involved. I agree with Nuruddin in the sense that I think the British government has done an admirable job in terms of trying to reach out to the Somali diaspora. But Somali diaspora represents maybe about 10 to 15% of the Somali population. Some 85% of Somalis are still in Somalia. I'm not sure if they are reached into. The stakeholders that are being invited to the London conference are 6 people, as far as I know, or adding to Silania would be 7 people. I think there is a feeling among many Somalis that there is still a vertical approach to Somalia by international players that's been going on for 20 years. Every time a conference is held for Somalia, whoever has the gun is invited to these conferences. Let's call it what it is. These people have guns and they're invited to the conference. I'm not saying these guns are necessarily used for bad things. In many cases, they're using it for very good purposes. They're stabilizing their territories. But I think what needs to happen, and that hasn't happened, and many Somalis are hoping to see in the London conference, is a horizontal approach to the Somalis, where you invite, as that happened several times, but not many times, you invite civil society leaders across the country who do not have guns, but they have a lot of intellect and understanding of the Somali society, and give them the voice. What tends to happen when you have a vertical approach is you invite few people, and then the next political dispensation is generally driven by the people who are invited to these conferences. So they essentially design who comes onto the political fore of the country. 2 brief examples on this. In 2004, there was a conference in Kenya. The warlords at the time were called. All of the Somali warlords were invited. No other person was invited to this conference. I mean, obviously traditional elders and so, but essentially warlords handpicked 275 members of the parliament. And then in 2008, the Somali government, the transitional federal government, and the Alliance for Re-Liberation of Somalia were called into Djibouti. The alliance was allowed to handpick another 275 members in addition to the existing 275. We've ended up with a whopping 555 member parliament. Why? Because very few people are given this choice. What needs to happen is Somalis, as Mary did very well explaining, Somalis are clans. If we're going to select next members of parliament, I think clans, since we cannot hold elections today, clans ought to be given the choice to select who is going to represent them in the parliament. Right now, people who represent Somali clans in the parliament are basically elected by a handful of individuals. It's a vertical approach. It has not worked for 20 years. We need a horizontal approach.